SonicLAB TV.
Got a bit of a treat for you today. We've been very lucky to be sent over direct from Japan a prototype of the Roland GAIA synthesizer. This is also known as the SH-01. It's a very portable, battery-powered, knob-encrusted virtual analog synthesizer. This is quite unusual for Roland because Roland have been getting a little bit of flack recently for their lack of synthesis capability, shall we say, when they've got such a strong legacy and history of analog synthesis. This virtual analog is 3 synthesizers in one. It has 64 voices, 37 keys, one of Roland's pitch and modulation wheels, USB connectivity, and a bunch more besides. Let's take a closer look. The synthesizer is very simply laid out. We've got LFO, oscillator, filter, an amplitude envelope. These are all independent for each of the 3 synths. So we've got 1, 2 and 3. You select which synthesizer you're editing by pressing the select button. You can also switch them on or off. If you want to edit more than one, press and hold more than one button. Starting with the LFO, we've got multiple shapes. Triangle, sine, sawtooth, square, a kind of sample and hold, and a random. You can tempo sync or have it free running. You've got a pre-delay, which is sort of a fade time, so that delineates how much time there is before the actual modulation cuts in. You can affect the pitch, filter or amplitude both positively and negatively. There's a center dent for each one. There's an additional LFO which deals with the modulation wheel. Accessing these parameters is very simple. All you have to do is press the shift button on the front panel, wiggle the modulation wheel, then you get access to a totally independent LFO with separate rate, waveforms and depths. Each of these LFOs is separate per synth, so you can set up some pretty complex additional modulation by having 3 synths all with different LFO depths and rates, so that's a nice touch. The D-beam is also a really good source of modulation. Right now I've got it mapped to the LFO rate of synths 1 and 2. To assign, all I have to do is press the assign button and move the parameter I want in the direction I want. So if I move it clockwise, i.e. faster, the D-beam will work in positive polarity. If I move it the other direction, the D-beam will work in negative polarity. Next up, we've got the oscillator. Let's just listen to the raw waves. Running our arpeggiator here. First one we're listening to is the sawtooth wave. There's also a square wave, a pulse width, which you can adjust the modulation and the actual pulse width setting with these 2 faders here, only for this particular wave. Triangle, sine, noise, and something called super saw, which is a bit like the Access Virus hypersaw, sort of multiple detuned waveforms. Each waveform has a variation. Pressing this button gives you one of 3, so that's 21 waveforms total. The waveform can also be detuned over 4 octaves and semitone steps and also has a fine tune. There's also this additional envelope here, which is just an attack decay envelope, and this is for pitch envelope. You can also sync 2 synthesizer models together. This would in fact be tone oscillator 1 and tone 2 oscillator, and you can also ring modulate. To my ears, they're not the finest sounding oscillators in the world, but they've got a lot of tonal scope and you've got plenty of harmonics in there, which is kind of what you want. They do alias a little bit in the top end, and perhaps they're not the fattest, but they should give you plenty of what you need. Okay, moving on to the filter. This is a multi-mode filter, switchable between low pass, high pass, band pass, and something called a peaking filter, which has a unique and quite interesting characteristic. It's switchable between -12 and -24. It's fully resonant. In fact, if you want to, you can quite easily set up a resonant filter pitch sound. This you're listening to here is actually just me playing the filter. It's got its own dedicated ADSR envelope with a positive or minus envelope depth. Finally, the amplitude section is a standard ADSR envelope, all on faders, again with a level for the overall voice. The last thing in the chain is the effects unit. This is global and affects all of the synthesizers simultaneously. Basically, you've got 5 effects in total. A distortion section, which is actually pretty good for tonal variation. This is just a straight single voice sawtooth, quite nice. Got a flanger, phaser and a pitch shift. Plus there's also a delay, panning delay, which you can tempo sync, quite a usable reverb, and a low boost, which is actually quite handy for adding a bit of bottom end to the sound in total. In addition to these two controls, there's also some additional control modes. So if you press Shift on the front panel, this will give you access to additional parameters, which perhaps like speed and feedback in terms of delay. There's also different algorithms for each of these distortions. So you get quite a lot of additional effects control from the front panel. Overall, I find that the synth engine in the Gaia is pretty good. I mean, it's a basic analog subtractive model, but the fact that you've got 3 separate synths really kind of means that you can get some quite complicated and powerful sounds, particularly when combined with the internal effects. In fact, every time I came to do a new shot for this review, I found that I quite often just wander off on a journey into sound, which is obviously quite good for an analog synthesizer, so it's got that compelling quality. There is more to the synth besides the synthesizer engine. We're going to take a look at some of those additional features now. There's also a dedicated arpeggiator. Switch this in. There's gate type effects, and there's up to 64 presets, switchable in banks. So we'll start with bank 1. A whole bunch of different presets there. We've also got a phrase recorder. Now this gives you 8 patterns, each with a maximum of 8 bars each. 1, 2, 3, 4. Once I've saved my pattern into a memory location, I can then play them back in sequence. Selecting the second one. There's my second one. I can record different kinds of data into a pattern. I can record everything. That'll be notes, pitch bend, and all of the front panel controls, or I can just record the notes, or just the pitch bend, or just the front panel controls for quite comprehensive performance recording. It's also possible to bring in external audio via an MP3 player or such via the stereo jack on the front panel. You can then blend this with the overall output and play along. And you can also center cancel in 3 different types to try and get rid of the vocal. This is not altogether successful, so if you don't like it, just hit the mute button. There is another little secret that the Roland GAIA is hiding, and that is, obviously this is a 37-note keyboard, but the synthesizer is 64 voices. Even if I play every single note all at the same time, I'm not going to run out of polyphony. That's a good thing, right? But what I discovered is that there's also, as well as the internal synth engine, there's an internal GM bank. So I've got my pianos, or if I fancy a bit of accordion, I can use that, or perhaps a bank of drums more likely. Thing is, personally, I would rather have had access to the individual synthesizers, the 3 separate synthesizers, as multi-timbral units, so I could address each one of them on its own MIDI channel. It's a shame that this is the only way it's been implemented. Now, there are also 2 USB ports. There's a B type, which allows you to put a memory stick in the back and save and manage all your patch data, but there's also an A type, which allows you to hook directly up to the computer. What this actually allows you to do is to use this as a MIDI interface and an audio interface. In practice, what this actually means is I can use this effectively as my sound card. If I've got a little mixer, I can record external audio in via the external into my DAW via the USB interface, and then route the audio back out from my DAW through the Gaia into the outside world. Quite a handy feature. It's going to be round about 500 UK pounds, which I guess will mean it's going to be somewhere between 750, 800 US dollars. Now, when you consider that the Juno DI I thought was really good value for money, I think perhaps this is still a little tiny bit expensive. Obviously, it's got more controls, but there's no display, and I think they perhaps missed a trick by making it non-multi-timbral. But let's not forget, this synth is capable of some really great contemporary sounds. It's got great effects, good computer integration, and plenty of polyphony, and also lots of hands-on control.